The Little Shepherd of Kingdom Come by John Fox Jr. Chapter 1 Two Runaways from Lonesome. The days of that April had been days of mist and rain. Sometimes for hours there would come a miracle of blue sky, white cloud and yellow light, but always between dark and dark the rain would fall and the mist creep up the mountains and steam from the tops only to roll together from either range, drip back into the valleys, and lift straight away as mist again. So that all the while nature was trying to give lustier life to every living thing in the lowland bluegrass. All the while a gaunt skeleton was stalking down the Cumberland, tapping with fleshless knuckles, now at some unlovely cottage of faded white and green, and now at a log cabin stark and gray. Passing the mouth of Lonesome, he flashed his scythe into its unlifting shadows and went stalking on. High up at the source of the dismal little stream, the point of the shining blade darted thrice into the open door of a cabin set deep into a shaggy flank of Black Mountain, and three spirits within were quickly loosed from aching flesh for the long flight into the unknown. It was the spirit of the plague that passed, taking with it the breath of the unlucky and the unfit, and in the hut on Lonesome, three were dead, a gaunt mountaineer, a gaunt daughter, and a gaunt son. Later the mother too. Just kinda got tired, as little Chad said, and soon to her worn hands and feet came the well-earned rest. Nobody was left then but Chad and Jack. And Jack was a dog with a belly to feed, and went for less than nothing with everybody but his little master, and the chance mountaineer who had sheep to guard. So, for the fourth time, Chad, with Jack at his heels, trudged up to the point of a wooded spur above the cabin, where at the foot of a giant poplar and under a wilderness of shaking June leaves were three piles of rough boards loosely covering three hillocks of rain-beaten earth, and near them an open grave. There was no service sung or spoken over the dead, for the circuit rider was then months away. So, unnoticed, Chad stood behind the big poplar watching the neighbors gently let down into the shallow trench a homemade coffin, rudely hollowed from the half of a bee-gum log, and unnoticed slipped away at the first muffled stroke of the dirt, doubling his fist into his eyes and stumbling against the gnarled bodies of laurel and rhododendron, until out in a clear sunny space he dropped on a thick velvet mat of moss and sobbed himself to sleep. When he awoke, Jack was licking his face, and he sat up, dazed and yawning. The sun was dropping fast. The ravines were filling with blue shadows, luminous and misty, and a far drowsy tinkling from the valley told him that cows were starting homeward. From habit, he sprang quickly to his feet, but sharply conscious on a sudden, dropped slowly back to the moss again, while Jack, who had started down the spur, circled back to see what the matter was, and stood with uplifted foot, much puzzled. There had been a consultation about Chad early that morning among the neighbors, and old Nathan Cherry, who lived over on Stone Creek in the next cove but one, said that he would take charge of the boy. Nathan did not wait for the burial, but went back home for his wagon, leaving word that Chad was to stay all night with a neighbor and meet him at the death-stricken cabin an hour by sun. The old man meant to have Chad bound to him for 7 years by law. The boy had been told that, and Nathan hated dogs as much as Chad hated Nathan. So the lad did not lie long. He did not mean to be bound out, nor to have Jack mistreated, and he rose quickly, and Jack sprang before him down the rocky path and toward the hut that had been home to both. Under the poplar, Jack sniffed curiously at the new-made grave, and Chad called him away so sharply that Jack's tail drooped and he crept toward his master. as though to ask pardon for a fault of which he was not conscious. For one moment, Chad stood looking again. The stroke of the falling earth smote his ears, and his eyes filled. A curious pain caught him by the throat, and he passed on, whistling down into the shadows below to the open door of the cabin. It was deathly still. The homespun bedclothes and handmade quilts of brilliant colors had been thrown in a heap on one of the two beds of hickory withes. The kitchen utensils, a crane and a few pots and pans, had been piled on the hearth, along with strings of herbs and beans and red pepper pods, all ready for old Nathan when he should come over for them next morning with his wagon. Not a living thing was to be heard or seen that suggested human life, and Chad sat down in the deepening loneliness, watching the shadows rise up the green walls that bound him in, and wondering what he should do and where he should go if he was not to go to old Nathan. While Jack, who seemed to know that some crisis was come, settled on his haunches a little way off to wait, with perfect faith and patience for the boy to make up his mind. It was the first time, perhaps, that Chad had ever thought very seriously about himself, or wondered who he was or whence he had come. Digging back into his memory as far as he could, it seemed to him that what had just happened now had happened to him once before, and that he had simply wandered away. He could not recollect where he had started from first, but he could recall many of the places where he had lived, and why he had left them, usually because somebody, like old Nathan, had wanted to have him bound out, or had misused Jack, or would not let the two stray off into the woods together when there was nothing else to be done. He'd stayed longest where he was now because the old man and his son and his girl had all taken a great fancy to Jack, and had let the two guard cattle in the mountains and drive sheep, and if they stayed out in the woods overnight, struck neither a stroke of hand nor tongue. The old mother had been his mother, and once more Chad leaned his head against the worn lintel and wept silently. So far, nobody had seemed to care particularly who he was, or was not, nor had Chad. Most people were very kind to him, looking upon him as one of the wandering waifs that one finds throughout the Cumberland, upon whom the good folks of the mountains do not visit the Father's sin. He knew what he was thought to be, and it mattered so little, since it made no discrimination against him, that he had accepted it without question. It didn't matter now, except as it bore on the question as to where he should start his feet. It was a long time for him to have stayed in one place, and roving memories stirred within him now, and took root, doubtless in the restless spirit that had led his unknown ancestor into those mountain wilds after the Revolution. All this while he had been sitting on the low threshold, with his elbows in the hollows of his thighs and his left hand across his mouth. Once more he meant to be bound to no man's service, and at the final thought of losing Jack, the liberty-loving little tramp spat over his hand with sharp decision and rose. End of Chapter 1, Part 1.